My name's Daniel Bushell. Caught on camera alleged provocations by Western forces and shocking brutality by their allies. Coming up.
Leaked army manuals expose U.S. covert ops in Syria, Egypt, and beyond. 9/11 and blowback. And the UN is branded as an instrument for war, targeting future colonies.
Organised groups of snipers shoot both peaceful protesters and police in Syria, triggering Western intervention. Here, groups of snipers, for no apparent reason, shoot both peaceful protesters and soldiers in Egypt. Unexplained snipers have sparked unrest in Thailand, Venezuela, and many of the other nations not under Washington's control. Also, Eric Draitser reported on the recent bloodshed in Egypt. Thanks a lot for joining us. Do we see the same thing in Syria?
That's correct. And again, if we examine the same situation in the early days of the Syria conflict, we have many reports from individuals on the ground talking about snipers stationed on the rooftops in cities such as Deraa, Hama, some of the early focal points of the protest movement. Remember that the conflict in Syria emerged out of a protest movement, but that protest movement was not a regime change movement. That was a protest movement and for economic reasons, fuel oil subsidies, perhaps some increased political voice, but it was certainly not a regime change scenario, and it certainly was not a violent civil war from the outset. However, what drove the conflict, what drove the violence in the conflict, were the presence of these snipers in the early days. So when you saw women and children being shot in the head in Deraa or in Hama, and they tried to immediately say that it was Assad's forces who were doing that, conveniently they never provided one piece of evidence to actually demonstrate that. And in fact, even the Arab League observer mission in early 2012, which was openly hostile to the Assad regime, which was clearly an anti-Assad mission, even the Arab League observer mission noted the fact that there was a quote-unquote a third force, a third element inside of Syria that was not the protest movement nor the government of Damascus, and it was some other element, and that element was driving the violence. And of course, as we see now 2 years later, it was incredibly successful in fomenting civil war.
Yeah, why wouldn't forces within the country do this?
It doesn't seem to make sense that either side would really have benefited from this kind of chaos. We need to understand this in this broad narrative of those elements internationally which seek to use violence as a pretext for destabilization. This is no longer the 19th century imperialism that we learn about in history books. You can't just go around invading countries and imposing your will by force and by violence. Rather, it has to be done in a more covert way. And one of the ways that you do that is by creating the necessary humanitarian cover.
Humanitarian cover is now official U.S. policy, revealed in the leaked new U.S. Army manual. Meant to be kept a secret document, the destruction notice reads, "Destroy by any method that will prevent disclosure." The Army manual was released in November 2010, just before snipers began appearing in Syria, designed to get round international outrage at direct invasions like Iraq. The new US Army manual instructs future country takeovers must be predominantly covert. The book lays out how to infiltrate ethnic and religious minorities to provoke civil war. Using snipers against peaceful protesters is an example. Work with guerrilla groups to make them respectable. Arming Al-Qaeda and painting them as victims fits this category. Syria is being bombed, as the report advises. An insider has told RT NATO allies Turkey and Israel are bombing from across the border. In fact, the West's been plotting this invasion of Syria for years. France's ex-foreign minister.
2 years before the violence started, British officials told me they were planning the invasion of Syria.
The Syrian opposition deny these claims. It is literally impossible for Africa to get out of debt, writes author Christophe Lehmann. France made its 15 ex-colonies sign a treaty sending earnings from their vast resources and all their gold reserves to Paris. French bankers earn 3% on it. then lend Africa's own money back at 6%. Africa's own money lent back to it as debt, the West is shameless enough to call aid.
All that African nations achieve by growing exports is to earn more for France.
Dr. Lehman's written extensively on neocolonialism. Great to have you on the show. What's been the result of all this?
The more the people labor, the more they export, the more debt they create for themselves. Yeah, well, it's a lose-lose situation because the reality of this kind of policy is that you have children starving, literally starving to death. France is creating a humanitarian disaster in Africa, and it's creating an economic disaster in Europe. You have a colossal market potential there, which actually could drag Africa out of its poverty and could drag the European Union out of its crisis.
The West created Gulf states by chopping Kuwait off Iraq, Saudi and other oil regions from the Arab Peninsula, and handed control to the four horsemen, Exxon, Shell, BP and Chevron, writes Big Oil and their bankers in the Persian Gulf, four horsemen, 8 families and their global intelligence, narcotics and terror network. The US literally took some, quote, truck drivers and mechanics off the streets and installed them to run the country. They pay them handsomely if they turn a blind eye while the four horsemen strip the country. The other 99% are kept in abject poverty, despite the country's incredible riches, notes author Dean Henderson, and US military protection has pushed the sheikhs beyond any decency.
That we had misused or got corrupted with 50 billion, I'll tell you yes, but I'll take that any time. What I'm trying to tell you is, so what?
Prostitution rings, drug trafficking, widespread paedophilia, sex slavery, torture so widespread and flagrant among America's puppet Arab rulers that the Sifia site simply lists thousands of the cases leaked to the media. UAE royal Issa Al Nahyan torturing a trader he thought, quote, cheated him. The billionaire abuses him with an electric cattle prod, beats him with whips and a plank of wood with a nail in it, then pours salt into his wounds. The prince shouts to the cameraman, get closer, so he can watch the tape back later. Bandar was imported as a child to be Saudi Prince Al Saud's sex slave, notes Sifia, and his passport confiscated. In this photo on a night out in London, the prince has already broken Bandar's nose and damaged his eye, lip and ear. Later, at a top hotel, he's caught beating his slave. In their room that night, he beat and kicked him to death. Saudi Prince Shaleen caught on a 727 flight to France with over 2 tons of cocaine.
Washington allows freedom from criminal and civil actions by giving them diplomatic immunity, retroactive diplomatic immunity, or other protection.
Let's talk to the author of Big Oil, Dean Henderson. Great to have you on. You write oil profits are pocketed by the four horsemen, so all Americans get are terrorist attacks from Arabs furious that their country's being robbed.
I don't even like the word neo-colonialism because, to me, what's the difference? Even the elites in those countries are very angry, sort of an unspoken anger at the United States. And they would love nothing more than to see us take a hit. And you can't blame them, even though they are crooks too. But yeah, there is that. And of course, 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia.
Terror colonies and war, vicious circles, writes Washington's blog, are the quickest way to destroy the aggressor's economy. Leading economist Dean Baker points out America's enormous military spending's a huge drain on growth and increases unemployment. War takes the nation's brightest minds from productive industries and gets them to perfect killing, which produces nothing. Let's speak to author of Questioning the War on Terror, Dr. Kevin Barrett. Thanks a lot for coming on. Why do government figures like Lawrence Summers call war a great job creator?
Lots of people go along with this because it's in their personal self-interest. Look at how military spending really works. What it does is it takes productive resources out of the real economy and puts those resources to work building things that serve no human purpose other than killing people. and wasting resources. And not only that, there's a very, very tight correlation, negative relationships between military spending and economic growth. So high military spending kills economies and kills societies. And that's what's being imposed on the U.S. The question is why?
Yeah, so in whose interest is this?
Where's the economic interest here? Well, it's actually the military-industrial complex that's colonizing the American people and draining it of its resources and stealing from it and looting it. That's what's real. So I think that's a big part of the puzzle here, is that these policies are being imposed by people who have this self-interest, whether it's people who are making money off the military-industrial complex, or whether it's some, banksters, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and those guys trying to build a new world order global government.
Global government in the shape of the UN, notes Christoph Lehmann, is currently working against countries next in line for, quote, humanitarian intervention. This US Army report called String of Pearls singles out these resource-rich, nuclear-free Asian states as next targets. In these countries, the George Soros-funded UN Team for Preventive Action, notes international lawyer Chris Black, is performing the very destabilization laid out in the US Army manual, such as promoting ethnic divisions. The UN works with the International Crisis Group, also funded by George Soros, along with Western governments. The ICG's concept is, quote, preventing conflict through military intervention. In other words, preventing war by waging it. The World Peace Society and many others note most wars only make things worse. Dr. Lehmann, what's going on?
The United Nations actually, instead of being an instrument for peace, has become an instrument for warfare.
Henry Kissinger argues former colonies have no statehood rights as they were artificially created first time round. Recolonizing them for being victims, notes NSNBC, sounds like another breathtakingly immoral case of the West's double jeopardy. This is the Truthseeker.